Hello and welcome. I'm George Beebe. I'm Vice President and Director of Studies at the Center for the National Interests in Washington, D.C. And I'll be moderating today's discussion on cyber rules between the United States and Russia. I think this is a very timely discussion. We've had a series of high-profile cyber events over the past 6 or 7 months, beginning late last year with the SolarWinds intrusion that our cyber experts believe was conducted by Russia in a massive intrusion against US government and related targets in the United States. This was followed by a ransomware attack on the Colonial Pipeline, which had a profound impact on the flow of petroleum products on the US East Coast. And then just before July 4th of this year, there was a large ransomware attack by a group called Revil, which US experts believe is based in Russia, on more than 1,000 US businesses and organizations. And all of these things, I think, have focused attention on a topic that President Biden has raised with President Putin, both in phone calls and in their direct meeting in Geneva, which is cyber rules. How can the United States and Russia agree on what is in bounds and what is out of bounds in the cyber domain? So to discuss this topic, we have here a pair of experts, one from Russia, one from the United States. Elena Chernenko heads the international section of the newspaper Kommersant. She is on the Presidium of Russia's Council on Foreign and Defense Policy and is a member of the Peer Center's Working Group on International Information Security and Global Internet Governance. Joseph Nye is former Dean of the Kennedy School, currently a Distinguished Service Professor at Harvard University, former Chairman of the National Intelligence Council, and has written extensively on the cyber domain, on influence operations, deterrence, and how the United States might reach some agreements with Russia and other countries on rules to manage and stabilize this domain. So I'm going to jump right into this discussion today by asking both our panelists a question. And I will note that attendees can submit questions of their own in written form by clicking on the question and answer icon at the bottom of their Zoom screens. So my question is this: just how central do you believe the cyber domain is to making the US-Russian relationship stable and predictable, which is what President Joe Biden has called for? Is this something that is nice to do, or is this something that's absolutely essential in order to stabilize the relationship? Joe, Elena, who would like to begin?
Go ahead, Elena.
Thank you very much. Good evening or good day to everybody. I'm very happy to be participating in this session today. As for your question, George, I can speak more from the Russian perspective, of course. And as far as I see it from here, it's not something very central. It's not a priority. It's more of Moscow answering the wishes to discuss this issue from Washington. Because what we have seen from Russian officials, what they were saying publicly before Geneva and afterwards, President Putin, Lavrov, and everybody else, they have their priority is strategic stability. Now, strategic stability not in the kind of a old-fashioned form, but this there is this new fancy formula which is being circulated here from Moscow since a few months, I think since the end of last year. It sounds like strategic equation. Now, within the strategic equation, there are several elements, and all of them are somehow connected, and cyber is just one of them, but not the most important one. Strategic nuclear weapons, missile defense, space, all of the conventional weapons with a possible strategic range. So Moscow wants to discuss all of this within that strategic equation, within the talks of strategic stabilities that are about to start next week between Russian diplomats and their American counterparts, and cyber is a part of them. There is two things that Russia would like to specifically mention in that aspect. One of them was raised by, I think, Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov last week. He said that Russia would like to discuss cyber as attacks on space assets being off limits. Another one was raised by, I think it was by Premier Minister Mishustin. He said that Russia would also like to specifically discuss that attacks on command and control centers that have to do with strategic stability should also be off limits. So two concrete things that Moscow is interested in discussing. The global issue of cybersecurity is, of course, very interesting for Moscow, and Russian diplomats have pushed this agenda forward at the UN since over 20 years. But I would not say that it's a priority, not that it's a central piece for making the relations with the US work.
Joe?
Well, I think if you look at the situation from the American side, cyber probably has a higher priority than Elena described as being Russian perspective. It's interesting that if one thinks back to summits between Russian and American leaders, nuclear weapons were usually the lead issue and the dominating issue. It's interesting that the Biden administration placed a great deal of emphasis and priority on the cyber issue in this meeting that was just recently held in Geneva. It doesn't mean that cyber weapons are more dangerous or more important than nuclear weapons. It does mean, though, that in terms of the friction between the two countries, cyber has become much more tense, much more difficult as a result of the events of the last 6 months or so. So in that sense, I think from the American point of view, I think cyber probably ranks higher than it does from the Russian point of view, as Elena described it. And that's going to be interesting in terms of how the bargaining will go forward in the future.
Can I jump in on that just quickly?
Yes, please.
I have the feeling that in the beginning of the Trump administration, the US was also interested in discussing this issue. If you remember just the very, very first meeting of Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, I think it was in Hamburg at the margins of the G20 or so. They had this sitting together for 2 hours. It wasn't a summit special, but at the margins. And they came out with two deliverables. One was the deconflicting mechanism over Syria. So they would somehow coordinate their efforts there in difficult situation. And the other, it was Rex Tillerson back then and Sergei Lavrov. They came out and said that they were creating a new special working group on cyber. They wanted to discuss cyber to try to come out with maybe even a new treaty. That was announced right there in Hamburg. But when Donald Trump and his delegation came back to Washington, it took them, I think, 1 or 2 days to come out with a tweet that no, there's not going to be a cyber working group. It's not going to work. That's not what they meant. As far as it was understood here in Moscow that he has gotten a lot of criticism because this was very close to the events in 2016. And the Washington establishment could not understand how it was possible to reestablish a new group with Russia on cyber, the one that was frozen after the Ukraine conflict. So there was efforts in the beginning of the Trump administration, but it didn't work out.
Joe, do you want to respond to that?
No, I think that's correct, that cyber has been a significant issue for some time in Washington. And it really goes back even before the Trump administration. There was an agreement before it was disrupted by the events relating to Ukraine. There was an agreement between Obama and Putin to set up a hotline related to cyber. It's never been used. But that indicates that this feeling that cyber is increasingly important has been a high priority in Washington for quite some time, that it has been raised with Russia for quite some time. I think Elena is correct that the events of 2016 about Russian interference in the American election meant that anything that Trump did with Russia in the 2017 was going to be difficult in domestic politics in Washington.
Well, so the United States and Russia may differ somewhat in how high a priority reaching a cyber agreement might be for them. But it looks like both are interested in reaching some kind of an agreement. My question, again, for both of you is, what obstacles do you think stand in the way of reaching some kind of workable arrangement on cyber matters? Joe, do you want to start?
Yeah, I think if we have to be careful when we say agreement in relation to cyber. Russia has proposed a treaty at the UN for more than 20 years. And the Americans have said for more than 20 years that a treaty along the lines of a arms control treaty, such as we had for nuclear weapons, is just totally unrealistic because it's unverifiable. There's no difference between a piece of cyber code, which is a weapon, and which is not a weapon, except in the mind and intentions of the programmer or the user. So the idea that you could verify a treaty of this sort that the Russians have proposed is really not something the Americans are likely to change their mind on. On the other hand, we and the Russians have agreed to work together in the UN group of government experts and in the open-ended working group of the UN to try to develop some general norms about cyber, among them being not attacking civilian infrastructure. And it's interesting that when Biden handed the list of the 16 items that the US conceived of as civilian infrastructure, handed that to Biden at Geneva, and that was an indication that we took those norms seriously. There's a feeling in Washington that the Russians don't, that they basically brought down Ukrainian utility service shortly after having signed the 2015 agreement, set out the norms that said you shouldn't do that. So there's been a mistrust of Russian behavior, but there has been some progress in terms of general areas where you could imagine the Americans and the Russians, each for their own interest, reaching some self-limits on their behavior. I think that's what Biden was trying to accomplish at Geneva, not to lay the basis for a formal agreement or treaty.
Alina?
I absolutely agree with Professor Na. It's not, we're not talking about some new big treaties. I would even say that right now the talks are about how to de-escalate and how to manage the confrontation that's going on. So if we're expecting things and looking at what obstacles are preventing the countries to agree on something, there is so many of them. So we could only agree on maybe expect them to agree on very minor things. Here I would like to remind you of what Vladimir Putin has concretely proposed on 25th of September last year. He has made this proposal openly, officially. It was back then still to the Trump administration, but Moscow took an effort to underscore that this was not to Donald Trump personally, but to any US president that will be elected in November. He has proposed a program of 4 steps. One of them was, for example, that the two countries would agree not to meddle into each other's elections by using cyber means. Moscow has proposed this right after the events in 2016 already. I think it was, again, Sergei Ryabkov, whom I mentioned today. He traveled especially to Washington in August 2017 to try to agree on such a treaty, an agreement, and any document that would protocol that the two countries would not meddle into each other's internal affairs by cyber means. That was not acceptable to Washington back then. Now Putin proposes again in September. Another thing that he proposes that all of the responsible agencies of the two countries that are doing cyber, that they should have communication lines open 24/7. Professor Na is exactly right. In 2013, they established such a hotline. There was a intergovernmental agreement. It was a whole package and one of the parts of that package was a hotline. Now, the Russian diplomats say that it was used once during the Sochi Olympics in 2014. It seemed that there was a cyber attack on the Russian critical infrastructure during the Olympic Games that was coming or routing through the territory of the United States. They used that hotline to connect with their American counterparts to check that, and then they got the information, and somehow it was all regulated. So at least once it seems to be used. Now, Putin proposes to strengthen that hotline and to make direct connection between all of the different agencies that are responsible for cybersecurity. Another proposal, which was in that program, is to try to establish kind of rules of the game in cyber domain, which would be similar to what the Soviet Union and the US established in 1972 to prevent incidents at sea. So Moscow is looking at this area as a cyber area, kind of similarly to the incidents at sea. And there was other proposals in the whole package of September, but they're not going to be a big agreement. Again, this is all about managing the confrontation, de-escalating, preventing big incidents from happening.
Joe, I want to follow up for a minute on what Elena has just said, because it strikes me that Vladimir Putin might have been reading things that you were writing about this and comparing a cyber rules of the road agreement to the old US-Soviet incidents at sea agreement, which worked fairly successfully. Could you comment a little bit on how we would have to approach creating that kind of an agreement in the cyber domain? And then I have another follow-up question for you after that.
Well, I published in a column about that idea of using the incident sea agreement as a model a couple of years ago. And I know it was understood and discussed among people in Washington and in the White House. And I think it was clear to people in Washington that Putin had proposed this last September. So I read what happened in Geneva as an example of how you start that process, which is that an incidents at sea agreement doesn't say here are exact rules of how close your planes or ships come to each other. It does say here's a process by which we say our interest is in avoiding escalation of incidents getting out of control, and we're going to set up a process by which we can communicate it. So in a sense, the fact that Biden and Putin discussed cyber in similar terms and agreed to set up a working group to follow up is, to my mind, a model of how you would begin the process of reaching the analogy of an incidents at sea agreement. So maybe step one has been taken, but it's too soon to tell. We'll have to see what happens. And certainly the interesting question to me is on the major ransomware attacks that happened over July 4th weekend and so forth. It's intriguing that they see that the REvil seems to have gone offline now. Now that might have been because President Putin said, close this down, telling security services, find out who this is and stop them. Might have been because the criminals who were running REvil decided better lay low for a while. It might have been because of an American attack by Cyber Command against the REvil servers. We don't know the answer to that. I hope it's number one.
Right. So, Joe, a quick follow-up. Elena pointed out that Vladimir Putin has once again proposed an agreement that neither side will meddle in the other's elections and domestic politics. Why wouldn't the U.S. agree to a proposal like that?
I think it's possible that that's something this working group could agree to. It's not going to be, elections are conducted differently and mean different things in the two countries. But it is possible that you could get an agreement along the lines of this incident sea type agreement, which is setting up zones or boundaries of which you go no further than a certain level, in which the two would indeed refrain from disrupting or badly interfering with each other's elections. So I think that could be among the things that would be included.
Okay.
And I really comment really shortly on what Professor Nye said on the working group.
Please.
I just want to point out that it seems that especially the US side is making an effort here to not call it a working group on the official level. Everybody says informal consultations or just consultations, and that seems to be the lesson from what happened in 2017 when Trump came back with that working mechanism and then he had to dissolve it the next day, and what happened in 2018 when the two sides were to try to restart this on an informal level, meet in Geneva, discuss exactly those issues that are on the table today. And the Russian delegation came, but their American counterparts, just a few hours before the negotiations were about to start, they had then a call from Washington to back off again, we'll go back to Washington, and then the consultations did not take place. So now it seems that both sides, and especially the US side, is trying to keep it very low key as far as public information outcome, about talking about possible deliverables. So it's kind of consultations. Let's see where we can go from here. It's not a working group. It's not back to normal, to business as usual as before Ukraine. But, well, that's an interesting aspect. Maybe if there is not as much, it's bad for me as a journalist to watch this, but maybe if there is not so much attention to this and the issue doesn't get as much politicized, maybe the results will be better.
I agree with both that diagnosis and that prescription.
Very good. Well, hopefully that will bode well for agreement between these different groups, regardless of the term you want to use for labeling them. We have a question from the audience from Jacob Heilbrunn, who is the editor of the National Interest magazine. And he points out that Professor Nye famously coined the term soft power and wants to know about how to apply that term in the cyber domain. He asks, is cyber warfare a form of soft power, or is it somewhere in between hard and soft?
Well, the way I define soft power is the ability to get what you want through attraction rather than coercion or payment. So the fact that cyber is intangible and doesn't involve kinetic weapons doesn't make it soft power. Question is, to me, is are there actions which one or the other side is taking which may attract others? And if it does them in cyber, then it could be soft power. But it's not the intangibility or the lack of kinetic force that makes the difference between hard and soft power.
Elena, any thoughts on this?
I think when Professor Nye talks about soft power, nobody else matters.
Okay, very good. So I want to talk a little bit about ransomware and cyber crimes. The United States and the president in particular has raised this matter quite directly with President Putin and saying that the United States is going to hold the Russian government accountable for criminal activities in the cyber domain that emanate from Russian territory or Russian cyberspace, even if the Russian government itself is not carrying out those crimes. Elena, could you comment on this from the Russian perspective? Why wouldn't Vladimir Putin crack down on criminal activities coming out of Russian cyberspace against the United States?
Well, I think that they would crack down on such activity if they were sure that they will get the safe favor in return. Vladimir Putin has said it clearly in Geneva that they had made some dozens of requests to the US last year and a few dozen this year, and they allegedly never got a response from Washington. So he was making clear that Russia was ready and is interested to cooperate in this matter, but it wants the same from Washington. And I think this is an issue where the Russian side is really interested in cooperating in, because at least on the official agenda at the UN level, Russia has been promoting this idea of making countries responsible for what's happening on their territory for many years. It's part of that agenda of the, first of all, of the government group of experts, where Russia was a part of and is a part of for many years. It's one of the rules that they established. It's not legally binding. It's kind of a moral codex, but still, one of the rules says that the countries should not allow such activity coming from the territory. And Moscow signed up to this and was one of the countries most actively promoting this. And the same idea is now being promoted in the open-ended working group, where Russia was the initiator of creating that. So at least officially, I can't say what's really inside the Kremlin thinking. I'm not a Kremlinologist, but at least officially they're promoting this. But Vladimir Putin again said in Geneva, if we are going to do that for you, you have to do the same for me. So it will, I think, very much depend on how much reciprocity will be there.
So Joe, a follow-up on this. Elena is saying the Russians want reciprocity. The implication, of course, is that the Russians believe that there are criminal or quasi-criminal groups operating in US cyberspace against Russia, and that the US government is unwilling to do anything to rein them in. Do you think that is going on, in fact?
I don't think that there are controlled or deliberate proxy criminal groups in the US attacking Russia, but it's possible that some criminal groups will route attacks on Russian targets through servers located in the United States. There's always going to be some degree of difficulty about being precise of what's an attack or not. I think if you take different types of cyber attacks, you want to think about cyber attacks which are run by government security services. Now, the Russians don't admit to having an offensive cyber capability, but everybody knows that espionage occurs. It's not illegal under international law. And something like the SolarWinds episode that you referred to could be seen as traditional espionage on the part of the Russian security services. The American complaint was that it was so large that it was virtually indiscriminate. But at least it was within the boundaries of what had been traditionally known as government activity, which each government could try to control and keep within bounds. When you get to pure criminal activity, much harder to know how much it's controlled. And then there's some groups in between, which are, Americans have often talked about groups of criminals who are known to the Russian security services and sometimes allowed to operate because it's useful. These are sometimes called proxies. So that in-between situation of proxies is an area which I think you tend to imagine it being closed down. To my knowledge, the American government doesn't use proxies in that way. It does have, obviously, the first type of capability and uses it. And on the third type, the pure criminals, which have no connection or are themselves hiding from the government, it is possible that there are some criminal groups that use, they may not even be located originally in the United States, but may use servers located in the United States to attack Russian targets. So three different things.
Yeah. Now, one might imagine that the Russian perception of the use of proxies by the US government might be different than our own perception on that matter. And I'll highlight, just as a follow-up, the Panama Papers incident, which many people believe was conducted by people, at least with connections in the United States, wasn't targeting Russia specifically, but certainly had a big Russian component to it, one that many people, high-level people in Russia, found quite problematic. Is that the kind of thing that the United States could or should crack down on?
Well, that's going to be an interesting problem if you have a Russian-American agreement tacit agreement, if you want, about limiting interference with each other's politics. If a non-governmental organization located in the United States releases papers such as the Panama Papers, which among their effects have incriminating evidence about Russian oligarchs or leaders, Russia says this is no different than when a group interferes with, let's say, with ransomware against American companies. That's the kind of thing I think you can imagine being discussed without much publicity and without much formal agreement in this consultations.
We have a question in from former U.S. Ambassador Chester Crocker. He would like to follow up on the incidents at sea question. And he asks, do our speakers view the incidents at sea agreement as moribund? Or is it being given adequate attention by the two governments, given the number of incidents that seem to be occurring between the two navies and militaries in the Mediterranean, Black Sea, and Baltic Seas?
Well, let me let Elena take a first shot at that one, and then I'll reply.
I think that Professor and I will be much better at this. I will just say a few thoughts that come into my mind. I think that we have here the example where politics at the moment and confrontation in politics are being more important than the rules of the game that were established way ago. We have seen this, for example, what happened in the Black Sea was that Defender ship, the British ship, and the Russian reaction to this. It's the UK making a statement through entering waters that Russia considers their own. Of course, everybody knows the risks and everybody knows the rules. But because the politics are here in the game, because Great Britain does not recognize Crimea being a part of Russia, and Russia, of course, views these waters as their internal waters. So that makes that, for example, specific agreement irrelevant to the situation, because it's not about the agreement, it's about politics.
I think Elena is right. I think the incidents at sea agreement has atrophied because of the very poor relations between the two countries. And it's possible you could reach some sort of arrangement in cyber, which would last for a little while, but which also would atrophy if the overall relations between the two countries worsened. It's a way by pressing the boundaries of things which seem to have been agreed, but pressing those boundaries is a way of sending signals about one's irritation or the dangers in the overall relationship. So in that sense, it's very difficult to isolate things like incidents at sea or cyber attacks from the condition of the overall relationship. In that sense, an improvement in the overall U.S.-Russian relationship would make it easier to go for those circumstances. After all, in both cases, they're designed to prevent irritations and escalation from one area affecting strategic stability overall. But that strategic stability overall is even more powerfully affected by the larger context of U.S.-Russian relations.
Well, on that subject of the larger context of the U.S.-Russian relationship, I want to ask about perceptions in each country. The United States oftentimes espouses the view that Russia has a fundamental national interest in sowing discord in the United States, oftentimes through cyber means, to try to undermine our democracy, to try to weaken the country, make us less effective in the international arena as a result of being less stable at home. Elena, does Russia see things that way? Or do the Russians think that what appears to us to be efforts to sow discord are in fact defensive responses by Russia to intrusions into Russia's own domestic political affairs that the Russians believe the United States is conducting.
George, that's a very good question. And I think we have seen here a kind of, when it comes to cyber diplomacy and these perceptions, we have seen here an evolution over the years. During the Arabic Spring and during the events of 2010, 2011, and 12, when Russia for the first time proposed at the UN level a draft convention on international cybersecurity, the red line that went through the whole text was, don't meddle in our internal affairs. Don't use any cyber means to kind of try to destabilize our society, to change the mood, destabilize the politics here, meddle into our social economic affairs, try to change our cultural code, and don't influence elections. Don't use, for example, social networks to influence public opinion here in Russia. So this document was, the main idea was like, don't interfere. Let's all kind of agree that we don't interfere in each other's internal affairs and everything will be fine. So most of the Western countries reacted to this document as, oh no, this is censorship. The Russians are trying to kind of block content. They don't want to talk about cybersecurity as protecting the networks, protecting the hardware, the software. They only want to talk about content. They want to establish more control over the internet, balkanize it, so have more control over their special segment, and put censorship everywhere. And they're paranoid about information wars. This was 10 years ago. Then 2016 happened. And then some other events, not only in the US, but also some events in Europe. And countries in the West, I think they changed their perception, and now they started to talk about information wars, about not meddling into internal affairs of other countries, not influencing elections, not trying to use social networks to spread fake news, propaganda, and ideas that are hostile to one's government, and trying to promote dissent and so forth. The same thing that they called paranoia 10 years ago, accusing the Russians of trying to spread censorship, is now, the coin has flipped. It's now important for Western countries too. I'm not saying that one of the sides is right or wrong. I think it's just an evolution of perceptions. Whether one country is thinking that they are being attacked and they have to kind of defend themselves by being more aggressive or so. But just as you said, that there is a perception that Russia is just wanting to destabilize the US. The same is felt here, that the American politics are meant to destabilize Putin's regime, to kind of divide the country, to throw the government away, and so forth. I think, yeah, there's very many misperceptions, and that evolution of the thought of how to approach cyber, the information war, that's very interesting.
Joe?
Well, I think we go back to the basic differences of the two societies and political systems. America has a First Amendment group criticizing both our government, but criticizing other governments cannot be prevented from doing so. The Russian political system places more emphasis on stability and tighter social norms. So there's a built-in area for misunderstanding between the two. And this is why I don't think you're ever going to get a detailed agreement. I can't imagine the United States being able constitutionally to tell a Russian exile group, for example, that they can't put something on the internet that's critical of Putin. And whereas the Russians might say, you put this on the internet critical of Putin, this is interference in our domestic politics. So in that sense, there's a built-in difference of the two societies, and it's bound to lead to misunderstanding. But you can still imagine in these consultations that we referred to earlier, something in which you say, all right, but the level of this has to be within limits. You can't do the kinds of things which here are the things that we think are too much. Here are the things you think are too much. I use an analogy of if you have a neighbor who's having a drunken party and they're playing their music very loud, you can go, you can phone them up or knock on the door and say, turn off the music. It's not going to happen. You could say, if the music gets above a certain level that I can't sleep, then I'm calling the police. That is more practical. And you can imagine something of that, both for cyber events which involve information of the type we were just discussing. You also imagine it in relation to espionage. It's one thing to do espionage. We're not going to try to stop it. You're not going to stop it. But if it gets to the level where you practiced it in SolarWinds, we're going to respond. So you can, and if you go back to the Cold War and think about espionage, there were what we used to call Moscow rules. There are certain things, if you captured the other side's spy, you didn't kill them. You arranged for their exchange. I suspect that rather than a detailed treaty, what we're going to wind up with is something like my analogy to the loud party or to the Moscow rules.
I really love that analogy. I have never thought of that like that, but it's absolutely, absolutely.
We have a question from former U.S. Ambassador Sandy Vershbow. He asked Professor Nye, what do you think of President Biden's proposal to declare specific types of critical infrastructure off limits for cyber attacks, including those that are conducted by nominally unofficial actors like REvil?
Well, it's a great question, Cindy. I think there's some people who said when you declare 16 areas off limits, does that mean that all the other areas are on limits? And I think it's useful that Biden gave the list of what we call critical infrastructure to Putin at Geneva, though it's obviously published. The Department of Homeland Security has had it on its website for years. But by handing it over, you're indicating I take this very seriously. But there is a danger that it means that you're not taking other things as seriously. So that's one ambiguity in it and one possible source of problems in the future. The other is the issue that you raise about what happens if it's not directly by the government, but as by a proxy or by a criminal group, which we think the Russian security service should be able to control. And that's the case that's up for watching very closely right now, as I mentioned earlier. We'll have to see whether the REvil going offline had anything to do with control by the Russian government or whether they just decided to lay low for a while.
Just a quick follow-up on this, Joe. The 16 areas that you're referring to that have long been up on the Department of Homeland Security website include many things that I think everybody would agree are unambiguously critical infrastructure. You know, the healthcare, nuclear reactors, dams, water treatment systems. But it also includes some things that I would say are sort of gray areas, like government facilities and the information technology sector. So my question is, do these areas need to be refined? In other words, is specifying what particular aspects of these sectors are off limits an important part of discussions between the US and Russia? And the second thing is cyber espionage against these areas intended to be off limits as well as damaging attacks? Or is it only those intrusions that are aimed at interfering with the operations of these areas, the things that should be off limits?
Well, as I mentioned, 16 is not a magic number. Indeed, in 2016, after the Obama administration had posted the 16 areas, they mentioned after the elections, that elections were also it's sort of a 17th category. Didn't have much effect. I think Obama said this to Putin at a meeting in September of 2016, but didn't seem to have changed Russian behavior. So I think discussion of what's in and out, the 16 is indicative, but it's not definitive. I mean, there are a lot of things that can happen outside the 16, which will be seen as threatening or more so. And there's some things inside the 16 where a given penetration of a network may be accepted if it's clear that it's for espionage, but may not be accepted if it is so disproportionate, so massive, that it could easily become attack. So, I mean, the complaint about SolarWinds was this wasn't your grandfather's espionage. This was such a wide-ranging attack that you couldn't distinguish it from preparing the battlefield. And so if you're going to spy on some of these things, and we expect you will, keep it down to a dull roar, to go back to my noisy party type of analogy.
A question from Paul Starobin, the journalist. He asked, how much of this cyber activity that we're seeing coming from Russia is Putin testing Biden in the same way that Nikita Khrushchev tested John F. Kennedy back in the early 1960s? Isn't this sort of standard form for a Russian leader?
Well, I'll take first crack at it, but Elena should comment as well. I think it may be. We don't know. And that's why I mentioned earlier that this current case that we're watching relating to Revil going offline is going to be indicative of that. We'll see. It certainly, if you have a issue such as cyber, which seems to be a higher priority right now for Biden than it does for Putin, according to what Elena said at the beginning of our conversation, that gives a chance for Putin to essentially use this as a signaling and testing mechanism. That may be the case. On the other hand, if Putin says, you know, this relationship with the Americans has gotten so poisonous, so out of hand, that it's actually hurting Russia. And while we love to twist the American tiger's tail, and while we love to poke a stick in the American's eye just to show off that we can do that every once in a while, this has gotten a little bit out of control. It's costing our economy. It's costing our position in relation to other countries, Europeans and others. So maybe we'd be better off just to cool this for a while. We don't know the answer to that. So it's a good question. Stay tuned.
Elena?
I think Professor Nye said it all. As I said, I'm not a criminologist. I'm always very, very careful when trying to kind of evaluate what they're thinking there in the Kremlin, what Putin is trying or not trying to do. He's always full of surprises. That's the only thing that I learned from kind of writing about foreign policy of Russia for years. Not writing as much of internal affairs, but when it comes to foreign policy, he is very fond of surprises. And yeah, that's one thing that you can be sure of. The other things are all under question mark.
A question from Joseph Bosco. He directs it to Mr. Nye, but I think, Elena, you're welcome to respond as well. Is there any indication of Russian-Chinese cooperation in cyber attacks?
There's certainly a great deal of Russian-Chinese cooperation in cyber overall. China has adhered to the original treaty proposals that Russia proposed in the UN. The Chinese and Russian positions in the UN group of government experts or the open-ended working group are very close. So the general Russian-Chinese alliance of convenience trouble when you can certainly exists in cyber. As far as I'm aware from people I've talked to who know more about this than I do, there has not been coordination of cyber attacks of the type that we discussed this afternoon.
Elena, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I would also not expect any coordination on cyber attacks. On the contrary, we have seen just about like 1.5 months ago, the Russian government, for the first time, publishing very detailed information about a whole set of attacks that happened on Russian critical infrastructure last year. And they published quite a lot of specific technical information about that attack, which was unusual for the Russian government to do. They haven't done this in so much detail before. Now, that information that was published here allowed IT experts from the West as well to try to kind of look at where the aggressor, who the aggressor might be. And one of the US-based companies, Sentinel Labs, they came out with a theory that it was actually the Chinese who attacked the Russian critical infrastructure. It was a very massive attack on a whole set of critical infrastructure assets here. Cyber espionage was one of them. One of the reasons to do this, they were actually downloading lots and lots of information, but they were doing this in a very, very sophisticated way. So, for example, they would set up websites with phishing emails that would then have malicious code programmed into them, but they were targeted. This was targeted phishing attacks. So the people that were working at specific government agencies in Russia would click on those websites or open that email that was coming to them, and it was targeted to that special person. So people actually took a lot of effort to do this. So the experts from Sentinel Labs, they say that this attack was actually coming from China. They had a whole theory of why this happened. We reported on this attack on the technical information that the Russian government has published on the theory that Sentinel Labs came out with. And then we confronted with those conclusions that American IT experts made the government here, and they were not confirming and not denying who the aggressor were. So the statement that was given to us, it kind of made it feel like they were aiming at putting all this information out there to maybe show the Chinese that, here, we are watching you, we know this, you're being watched, this is not going to go away innocently, you can't do this. So I would not expect Russia and China to be coordinating cyber attacks together against third countries. It's rather than that Russia is also being a target of the Chinese sometimes. We don't know how much of these attackers are being proxies or directly controlled by maybe the Chinese government, but it's an issue here too, a security issue.
We have a question from Jacqueline Kerr that I'm going to add a little twist to. She asks, there's been a lot of internal debate and evolution in US cyber strategy over the last few years. To what extent does Russia follow and respond to these shifts in US cyber strategy? And she's thinking in particular about our adoption of the so-called defend forward or persistent engagement strategy, where the United States is attempting to deter and undermine attacks on the United States by going into the Russian networks and undertaking operations of our own against Russian actors. And my twist on this is, does Russia regard this as an escalatory act? Or is this the kind of thing that would in fact cause a change in Russian government cost-benefit calculations as they consider their own cyber activities? Elena, you want to start out on this?
I think I could take the first part of the question, where Russia is following or not. I think that partly yes. We have seen, for example, first the US cyber strategy being published in 2011 or so, where the US for the first time said that it would reserve itself the right to respond to a major cyber attack with all means available, to it. And then I think half a year after that, the Russian Ministry of Defense published a white paper that had similar wording in it. So it was kind of showing, yes, we are looking at the same things and we are ready to respond the same way. And in some other areas, I think there's also the feeling that Russia is often more responding and reacting than being proactive when it comes to its national doctrines and the national politics. But on the international stage, I would say that that maybe Russia is sometimes even more active as the US is. Russia was the first to propose back in 1998 a first resolution of the UN General Assembly that had to do with cyber. That was more than 20 years ago. Russia was the initiator of this government group of experts on cyber, where there was first there were 15 countries, then 20, then I think 25 in the end. Russia proposed creating the open-ended working group that now all of the countries are part of. So I think internationally, Russia is often being the pioneer, the initiator. But when it comes to national doctrines, I think it's more closely watching what the US does and then reacting.
Joe, I'll give you the final word to you on this.
I accept Elena's answer on that. She knows a lot more about that than I do, but I wonder if I could end by asking Elena a question. You're right, Putin is full of surprises, and they're not going to ask you to predict what's going to happen inside the Kremlin. I don't think anybody knows except Putin. But you are a smart journalist, and you've been observing this closely, or more closely than the rest of us. What's your guess about how you see US-Russian cyber relations evolving over the next year or so?
That's a good ending question, but I would say I'm cautiously optimistic after Geneva, because that issue clearly was discussed in such a way that allowed the specialists of the two countries to meet for the first time since years. They met in the end of last week. They discussed things. We don't know what exactly, but you're absolutely right. We have seen, for example, that group Rebel disappear all of a sudden. That might be a reason why. And I think that if there's political will to at least agree on that, making the noise at the party a bit less than is very, very annoying for the other side, I think that's already more than one could hope for. Maybe some small agreements, maybe not official ones, maybe some rules of the road as rules of the sea, as we have seen in 72. Not expect too much, but I would say I'm optimistic.
That's very interesting. Thank you.
What do you think?
I tend to agree with that, though I sort of would hedge my bets a little bit. And that'll depend if something goes wrong in a larger US-Russian relationship, suppose some event related to Ukraine, that would, I think, torpedo this progress. But we'll see. It did
already. I mean, it was the case in 2013.
Right.
When everything was frozen. We'll see.
Yep. Well, we'll have to hope.
Well, on that mix of caution and optimism, we're going to draw this conclusion to an end. I want to thank both of our panelists here for what I think has been an outstanding discussion today. It's clearly an issue that is going to be a one in motion over the next several months. So we will follow that closely, and I will look forward to seeing our audience again at the next Center for the National Interest event. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Have a good day. Bye-bye.